The grand ballroom of Harrington House blazed with 1,000 candles, their golden light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. 300 of London's most distinguished guests swirled across the dance floor, in a carefully choreographed waltz, their silk gowns and tailored coats a blur of colour and elegance. It was the social event of the spring season, the kind of evening where reputations were made or destroyed with a single misstep, where every glance was noted and every whisper would become tomorrow's scandal. At the centre of it all, Arthur Fairmont, the 7th Duke of Ashbourne, guided his young wife through the steps of the dance with mechanical precision. His hand rested at her waist, but there was no tenderness in his touch, no warmth in his aristocratic features as he looked past her rather than at her. To the casual observer, they made a striking pair. The Duke, tall and commanding in his evening blacks, every inch the powerful nobleman, and the Duchess, young and delicate in an emerald gown that couldn't quite disguise her condition, 6 months pregnant with the heir everyone had been waiting for. But those who looked closer might have noticed the tension in the Duke's jaw, the way his eyes remained cold and distant. They might have seen how the young Duchess trembled slightly, how her face had gone pale beneath the candlelight, how her free hand kept drifting protectively to her swollen belly. They might have noticed that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Augusta Fairmont could barely hear the music anymore. The violins seemed to come from very far away, their melody distorted and strange. The ballroom had grown unbearably hot, the press of bodies and the weight of hundreds of judging eyes making it impossible to breathe. Pain radiated through her abdomen in waves, each one stronger than the last, and she felt a warmth between her legs that filled her with cold terror. She tried to focus on Arthur's face, tried to find something there to hold on to, but his expression remained as closed and unreadable as it had been for the 6 months of their marriage. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. "Please, I need to stop. Something's wrong." His grip on her waist tightened, but not with concern, and with irritation. "Steady yourself," he said quietly. His words meant only for her. "We're nearly finished. Don't make a scene. Don't make a scene." Those 4 words echoed in Augusta's fading consciousness. For 6 months she had followed that unspoken rule. Don't make a scene when he barely spoke to her at breakfast. Don't make a scene when he kept to his chambers in the East Wing while she remained alone in the West. Don't make a scene when he announced her pregnancy to his solicitor with the same enthusiasm one might show ordering new curtains. Don't make a scene when he told her they would attend this ball tonight, making their first public appearance as Duke and Duchess, never once asking if she felt well enough to stand, let alone dance. The ballroom tilted dangerously. Augusta blinked, trying to clear her vision, but black spots danced at the edges of her sight. The pain in her abdomen had become a living thing, sharp and unrelenting, and the warmth between her legs was spreading. She could feel it now, could feel something fundamentally wrong happening to her body, to their child. "Arthur," she tried again, her voice breaking with desperation. "The baby. Please, I think I'm—" But he wasn't listening. His attention had already moved beyond her to someone across the ballroom, probably one of his parliamentary colleagues or business associates, the kinds of people who mattered to him. Unlike her? Unlike the child she carried, she was simply the vessel for the heir he needed, the unfortunate necessity that had come with saving his estates and preserving his precious legacy. The music swelled toward its crescendo. One more turn in the waltz, one more rotation around the floor with all of London watching. Augusta tried to move her feet, tried to maintain the pretense of grace and dignity that was expected of a duchess. But her legs had turned to water, and the pain had become excruciating. "Arthur!" His name left her lips one final time, not as a request but as a plea, as a prayer, and then her legs simply gave out. Time seemed to slow in that terrible moment. Augusta felt herself falling, her hand reaching desperately for Arthur, for any support that might catch her. She saw his eyes widen in shock, saw him finally look at her, really see her for the first time in 6 months. His arms reached out, but too late, always too late, and she felt herself going down. The ballroom spinning above her, the faces of 300 witnesses blurring into a kaleidoscope of shock and horror. Arthur lunged forward and caught her halfway down, breaking her fall but unable to prevent them both from crashing to the floor. Augusta's head came to rest against his chest. and she could hear his heart pounding, could feel his arms around her at last, holding her the way she'd dreamed he might hold her during all those long, lonely nights. But it was all wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. The music stopped mid-note, the abrupt silence somehow more deafening than the orchestra had been. Screams erupted from the crowd as people pressed forward to see what had happened. Women gasped and turned away, while men shouted for doctors and cleared space around the fallen Duchess. And beneath Augusta's beautiful emerald gown, a dark stain was spreading across the white marble floor, pooling around them in an ever-widening circle of red. Augusta! Arthur's voice cut through the chaos, and there was something in it she'd never heard before. Fear. Raw, undisguised fear. Augusta, can you hear me? She tried to focus on his face hovering above hers, tried to hold on to consciousness, but it was slipping away like water through her fingers. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly, to the child she'd loved for 6 months while his father couldn't bear to acknowledge either of them. The baby, she managed to whisper, each word an effort. I'm sorry. I tried to tell you. I tried. Don't, Arthur said sharply, and his hand covered hers where it rested on her belly. His fingers were warm, and Augusta realized with a sort of distant surprise that this was the first time he'd willingly touched her since their wedding night. Don't apologize. Just hold on. Please, Augusta, just hold on. She wanted to. God, how she wanted to. But the darkness was closing in, soft and quiet and strangely peaceful after so much pain. She looked up at her husband's face one last time, at the features she'd studied from across dinner tables and through doorways, memorizing every line while he looked everywhere but at her. I loved you, she whispered, the words she'd never dared speak aloud finally breaking free. I'm sorry I wasn't her. I'm sorry I could never be Carolyn. The last thing Augusta saw before the darkness claimed her completely was Arthur's face crumbling, the mask of cold indifference finally shattering to reveal something raw and broken underneath. The last thing she heard was him calling her name, his voice breaking on the syllables, full of an anguish that came 6 months too late. Augusta! Someone get a doctor! Augusta! Arthur gathered her limp form against his chest, and his coat soaked through with her blood. Around them, London's elite stood frozen in horror. 300 witnesses to a tragedy that would be whispered about in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs for years to come. The Duke of Ashbourne, they would say, the man with a heart of ice, had finally broken. But would it be in time to save the woman he'd refused to love? Or had his coldness already cost him everything? 6 months earlier, on a grey January morning, Augusta Winters stood at the altar of a small chapel on the Ashbourne estate and wondered if she was making the greatest mistake of her life. The stone walls around her were cold and unwelcoming, and only 4 people occupied the pews. A solicitor who served as witness, a vicar who looked uncomfortable, and 2 servants who'd been pulled from their duties to fulfill the legal requirements. No family, no friends, no celebration, just a transaction dressed up in the trappings of a wedding ceremony. Arthur Fairmont stood beside her, tall and rigid as the marble columns that lined the chapel. He didn't look at her. He hadn't looked at her once since she'd arrived at the estate 3 days ago. His eyes remained fixed on some point beyond the vicar's shoulder, his expression carved from stone. He wore black, full mourning attire, and Augusta understood the message perfectly. This wasn't a beginning. This was simply a duty he had to perform, like signing estate documents or attending Parliament. The vicar cleared his throat nervously and began the ceremony, his words echoing in the nearly empty space. Augusta barely heard them. She was too focused on breathing, on standing upright, on maintaining some shred of dignity in this humiliating farce. She'd known what she was agreeing to when her father's solicitor had presented the offer. The Duke of Ashbourne needed a wife quickly and quietly. He needed an heir to secure his estates, and he needed someone who understood this would be a marriage in name only. Augusta had needed security. After her father's death left nothing but debts and scandal, after her mother had died of shame and heartbreak, after the creditors had taken everything, she'd had nowhere to go. No family. No prospects, no hope, and then this offer had arrived. Marry the Duke, give him an heir. In return, she would have a home, an income, a position in society. She would be a duchess, even if she would never truly be a wife. Do you, Arthur Edmund Fairmont, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The vicar asked. I do. The words were flat, emotionless, spoken with the same enthusiasm one might show when confirming a business appointment. The vicar turned to Augusta. "And do you, Augusta Margaret Winters, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Augusta's throat tightened. She could still walk away. She could refuse, could run from this cold man and this loveless arrangement. But run to where, to what? She had nothing. She was nothing. At least here she would be safe. At least here she would have a purpose, even if that purpose was simply to produce an heir for a man who would never love her. "I do," she whispered. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife with obvious relief, eager to have this uncomfortable ceremony finished. "You may kiss the bride," he added, more from habit than expectation. Arthur turned to her then, and Augusta finally saw his face fully for the first time. He was handsome in a severe way, with dark hair touched with grey at the temples, sharp cheekbones and hazel eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. He looked at her as one might look at an unpleasant task that had to be completed. Then he leaned forward, pressed his lips to her forehead in a gesture that felt more like a dismissal than a kiss, and stepped away. "Mrs. Wilson will show you to your chambers," he said quietly. These were the first words he'd spoken directly to her. "You'll have everything you need. The West Wing has been prepared for you." "The West Wing?" Augusta repeated, confused. Weren't they supposed to share chambers? Wasn't that how marriage worked? Arthur's expression hardened further, which she hadn't thought possible. "I maintain my chambers in the East Wing. You'll have your own space, your own servants, your own life." He paused, and something dark flickered across his face. "This marriage serves one purpose, Augusta. I need an heir. Once you've conceived and delivered a healthy child, our obligations to one another will be fulfilled. Until then, we'll maintain the appearance of a proper marriage for the sake of propriety. But make no mistake about what this is. This changes nothing about who I am or what I'm capable of feeling." The words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of the foolish hope Augusta hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. She'd known this was an arrangement, had agreed to it with open eyes, but some small part of her had imagined that perhaps over time they might find some companionship, some kindness, something more than this cold rejection. "I understand," she said, lifting her chin with as much dignity as she could muster. She wouldn't let him see how much his words hurt. She wouldn't give him that power over her. Arthur nodded once, then turned and walked out of the chapel without another word, without looking back. Augusta stood alone at the altar, still wearing her simple travelling dress since there had been no wedding gown, no trousseau, no preparation for this mockery of a ceremony. The vicar quietly excused himself. The servants disappeared, and Augusta was left in the cold, empty chapel, legally bound to a man who had just made it perfectly clear that she would never be anything more than a means to an end. The first month of marriage was a study in loneliness. Augusta barely saw her husband. They took breakfast in separate rooms. Lunch was informal, and she ate alone in her chambers. Only dinner required their joint presence, and even then Arthur would arrive late, eat in silence and leave as quickly as propriety allowed. When he did speak, it was about estate business or weather or other meaningless topics that required no real engagement. Augusta tried at first to bridge the gap between them. She asked about his day, about his interests, about his childhood. She shared stories from her own life, tried to find common ground, attempted to build some foundation of friendship, if not affection. But Arthur responded to every overture with cold politeness or complete silence. He would look at her as if she were speaking a foreign language he had no interest in learning, and then return his attention to his meal or his correspondence. The servants pitied her. Augusta could see it in their faces, hear it in their careful whispers. Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper who had served the previous Duchess, made no secret of her disapproval. "His Grace will never love another," she told Augusta one day while showing her the household accounts. The first Duchess was everything to him. She was beautiful, accomplished, beloved by all. When she died bringing his child into the world, something in his Grace died with her. "You're just a necessity, Your Grace. Best you understand that now and save yourself the heartbreak of hoping for more." Augusta had nodded and said nothing, but the words burrowed deep. She began to understand that she wasn't just competing with Arthur's grief. She was competing with a ghost, with a perfect memory that could never be matched or overcome. Caroline, the first Duchess of Ashbourne, smiled down from portraits throughout the house. Caroline, who had been everything Augusta was not. Beautiful where Augusta was merely passable. Graceful where Augusta was awkward. Beloved where Augusta was tolerated. One day in late February, Augusta discovered Caroline's portrait in the main gallery. She stood before it for a long time, studying the face of the woman who would always stand between her and her husband. Caroline had been lovely, with golden hair and blue eyes and a serene smile that spoke of confidence and joy. She'd been painted in a rose-colored gown, surrounded by flowers, looking every inch the perfect duchess. Augusta caught sight of her own reflection in the glass protecting the portrait. Dark hair instead of gold, brown eyes instead of blue, a thin face marked by recent hardship rather than a lifetime of comfort and security. No wonder Arthur couldn't bear to look at her. Every time he did, he must see only what she wasn't, who she could never be. In early March, during a silent breakfast, Augusta felt a wave of nausea so strong she had to excuse herself abruptly from the table. She barely made it to her chambers before being violently sick. For 3 days the nausea continued, and on the 4th day the doctor was summoned. "Congratulations, Your Grace," he said with a warm smile. "You're with child." "About 6 weeks along, I'd estimate." Augusta's hand went instinctively to her still flat stomach. A child. Arthur's child. The heir he'd married her to produce. She felt a strange mixture of emotions. Joy because despite everything, this was a life, a person she would love. Fear because childbirth had killed Caroline, and what if the same fate awaited her? And something like hope, foolish though it was, that perhaps this child might bridge the gap between her and her husband. The doctor insisted on informing the Duke immediately. Arthur arrived at her chambers within the hour, the first time he'd come to her room since their wedding night. He stood in the doorway, keeping a careful distance, his face unreadable. "The doctor tells me you're expecting," he said. "Yes," Augusta replied, searching his face for any sign of pleasure or excitement. "In October, he believes." Arthur nodded once. "I'll inform the solicitors. The succession must be properly documented." He paused, then added, "You'll have the best care available. Anything you need only ask Mrs. Wilson." "Thank you," Augusta said quietly. "Arthur, I thought perhaps we might—" "Inform me when the confinement begins," he interrupted, his voice flat. "Until then, continue as you have been. I trust you'll take appropriate precautions for the child's health." And then he was gone, leaving Augusta alone with her hand on her belly and tears streaming down her face. He'd spoken about the child with less warmth than one might discuss a new horse for the stables. There had been no joy, no relief, no acknowledgement that this child was anything more than a requirement to be checked off a list. That night, Augusta began keeping a diary, pouring out her heart to the mother she'd lost, to the friends she didn't have, to the future she'd once imagined and would never have. She wrote about the baby growing inside her, about the fierce love she already felt for this tiny person. She wrote about her husband, about the man she glimpsed sometimes in unguarded moments, the flicker of pain in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. She wrote about her own foolish heart, which, despite everything, despite 6 months of coldness and rejection, had begun to love the man who could barely stand to be in the same room with her. By summer, Augusta's condition was obvious. Her belly had rounded, and she felt the baby move inside her. Small flutters at first, then stronger kicks. She would sit in the garden she'd begun to restore, placing her hands on her stomach, talking softly to the child who couldn't hear her yet. She told the baby about his father, about the man Arthur had been before grief had broken him. She'd heard stories from the older servants, tales of a duke who had once laughed, who had been devoted to his first wife, who had been kind and generous. "He loved her so much," Augusta whispered to her unborn child. "And when he lost her, he lost himself too. But you'll bring him back. When he sees you, when he holds you, he'll remember how to love again." She had to believe that. It was the only hope she had. One afternoon in September, Augusta was walking through the portrait gallery when she saw Arthur standing before Caroline's painting. She'd learned his routines by now, knew he came here every Wednesday, knew he visited Caroline's grave in the family cemetery every Sunday. He didn't know she watched him, didn't know she'd seen him place fresh roses on the grave, didn't know she'd heard him talking to the headstone, telling his dead wife about estate matters and politics, and everything he refused to share with his living wife. Augusta turned to leave, not wanting to intrude on his private grief, but a floorboard creaked beneath her feet. Arthur's head turned sharply, and for a moment their eyes met. She saw something in his expression then, something beyond the usual coldness. Guilt, perhaps, or pain, or just the weariness of a man trapped in a life he hadn't chosen. Then his face closed again, and he walked past her without a word, his shoulder brushing hers in the narrow gallery. Augusta stood alone before Caroline's portrait, one hand on her swollen belly, and understood with sudden, crushing clarity that this was her life now. She would raise Arthur's child, manage his household, bear his name, but she would never have his heart. That belonged to a ghost, and the dead don't give up their hold easily. As September gave way to October, the invitations began arriving. The London season was beginning, and society expected the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne to make an appearance. Arthur had avoided social engagements throughout the summer, using Augusta's condition as an excuse. But now the Harrington ball loomed, and there was no way to refuse without causing offence. "We'll attend," Arthur informed her over dinner one evening. "It's time we were seen together. Society expects it." Augusta's heart sank. She was 6 months pregnant, often tired and uncomfortable. The thought of a crowded ballroom, of hours on her feet, of navigating society's judgment and curiosity, filled her with dread. But she couldn't refuse. This was part of their arrangement, part of the role she'd agreed to play. "Of course," she said quietly. "Whatever you think best." Arthur looked at her, then really looked at her, and something flickered across his face. Concern, regret? But it was gone before Augusta could name it, and he returned his attention to his meal. Neither of them knew that the Harrington ball would change everything. That the cold arrangement they'd maintained for 6 months was about to shatter completely. That sometimes it takes losing everything to finally understand what you had. The night of the ball was coming, and with it, a reckoning neither of them was prepared to face. The morning of the Harrington ball arrived with grey skies and a chill in the air that seemed to seep into Augusta's bones. She woke feeling unwell, a persistent ache in her lower back and a heaviness in her abdomen that she tried to dismiss as normal discomfort. At 6 months pregnant, she'd grown accustomed to various pains and inconveniences. This, she told herself, was no different. Her lady's maid, Mary, helped her dress with gentle efficiency, lacing her into the emerald gown that had been specially made to accommodate her condition. The silk was beautiful, the colour rich and deep, but no amount of clever tailoring could truly disguise Augusta's swollen belly. She looked exactly like what she was, a pregnant woman who had no business attending a grand ball. "You look lovely." "Your Grace," Mary said softly, but Augusta caught the worry in her eyes. "I look like a whale in a ball gown," Augusta replied with a weak smile. "But it can't be helped. His Grace insists we attend." As if summoned by her words, Arthur's voice drifted through the open doorway of her dressing room. He was in the corridor instructing his valet, and his words carried clearly. "Keep the evening brief, Henderson. I have no desire to parade her about like some prize mare. We'll make our appearance, dance once if required, and leave as quickly as propriety allows." Augusta felt the words like a physical blow. Even now, even after 6 months of marriage, after carrying his child, she was still just an embarrassment to him. Something to be hidden away, brought out only when absolutely necessary, then returned to her lonely chambers in the West Wing. Mary's hand squeezed her shoulder sympathetically, but Augusta straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She wouldn't cry. She'd learned not to cry anymore. Tears changed nothing, and Arthur certainly wouldn't care about them. The carriage ride to London was torture. Augusta sat across from Arthur, in the close confines of the coach, the space between them feeling like an impassable chasm. He read through correspondence, barely acknowledging her presence. Augusta tried to find a comfortable position, but the baby was pressing against her ribs, and the ache in her back had intensified. "Are you unwell?" Arthur asked suddenly, not looking up from his papers. Augusta was so surprised by the question that she answered honestly. "A bit uncomfortable, but nothing unusual." He nodded curtly and returned to his reading. They rode in silence for several more minutes before Augusta felt the baby kick, a strong movement that made her gasp softly and place her hand on her belly. Arthur's eyes flickered to her, then away. "What is it?" "Nothing, Your Grace. The baby moved, that's all." For a moment something crossed his face. Curiosity, perhaps, or longing, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, and he looked deliberately out the window, his jaw tight. "We'll arrive within the hour." Try to compose yourself, compose herself, as if she were the one creating tension, the one making this unbearable. Augusta bit back the retort that rose to her lips and focused on breathing through the growing discomfort in her abdomen. Harrington House blazed with light as they arrived, every window glowing, music and laughter spilling out into the night. Carriages lined the street, disgorging London's elite in their finest attire. Augusta took Arthur's offered arm as they ascended the steps, acutely aware of the stares that followed them. The reclusive Duke of Ashbourne and his mysterious young bride, finally making a public appearance. The whispers started immediately as they entered the ballroom. Augusta could hear fragments of conversation, feel the weight of hundreds of curious, judging eyes. So young, already with child. I see. They say he never speaks to her. Poor thing. Married to a man still in love with a ghost. Arthur's face remained impassive, but his grip on her arm tightened slightly. As soon as they'd been properly announced, he released her. I have business associates to greet, he said stiffly. You'll manage on your own, I trust. And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of gentlemen near the far side of the ballroom, leaving Augusta standing alone like an unwanted piece of furniture. The ache in her abdomen sharpened into something more concerning, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She needed to sit down, needed air, needed to leave this suffocating place. But before she could move, a tall, elegant woman materialized at her side. Lady Victoria Ashford, Arthur's cousin and, according to servants' gossip, the woman he'd been expected to marry before his mother had arranged his match with Augusta. Instead, "My dear Duchess," Lady Victoria said, her smile not reaching her cold blue eyes. "How brave of you to attend in your condition. You look absolutely peaked." Lady Victoria, Augusta managed, trying to maintain her composure despite the increasing pain. "I must say, when I heard Arthur had remarried, I was shocked. We all thought he'd never recover from losing darling Caroline." Victoria's voice dripped with false sympathy. "She was the love of his life, you know. Absolutely devoted to each other. The Ton quite expected he'd remain a widower forever. Then his mother forced him into this arrangement." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, finding its mark with precision. Augusta's vision swam, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. "Are you quite well?" Victoria asked, though her tone suggested she didn't care at all. "Come, you simply must meet the Countess of Pemberton. She's dying to know all about the mysterious young woman who trapped the Duke into marriage." Augusta wanted to refuse, wanted to find a quiet corner and sit down, but Victoria had already taken her arm and was steering her through the crowd. The room felt unbearably hot, the press of bodies overwhelming. The pain in her abdomen was becoming constant now, a low, persistent throb that made it difficult to concentrate on the introductions being made around her. Across the ballroom, she could see Arthur laughing with a group of gentlemen, his face animated in a way she'd never seen. It was the first time in 6 months she'd seen him smile, truly smile, and the sight was like a knife to her heart. He could laugh. He could be warm and engaging and human, just not with her. Never with her. The Master of Ceremonies' voice cut through the din. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne will lead us in the next waltz." Augusta's blood ran cold. A waltz. Standing, moving, being watched by everyone, while she could barely remain upright. She saw Arthur's face across the room, saw the flash of irritation before he composed his features and began making his way toward her. When he reached her side, his hand cold and impersonal at her elbow, he leaned close enough for only her to hear. "Can you manage this without embarrassing us both?" Pride, foolish pride, made Augusta lift her chin. "Of course, Your Grace." But as Arthur led her onto the dance floor, as 300 pairs of eyes turned to watch them, as the pain in her belly intensified, and she felt the first warm trickle of blood down her inner thigh, Augusta realized with growing horror that she'd just made a terrible, terrible mistake. The music began, and Augusta stepped into her husband's arms for what would be the most devastating dance of her life. Arthur's hand settled at Augusta's waist, his other hand taking hers in the proper waltz position. His touch was cold, impersonal, the grip of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than holding his wife. As the orchestra began to play, they moved into the familiar pattern of the dance, and Augusta felt the full weight of 300 stares boring into them. The first turn was manageable. Augusta focused on the steps, on maintaining her posture, on not letting anyone see the pain that was building with each passing moment. But by the second turn, the ballroom had begun to tilt dangerously. The candlelight blurred into streaks of gold, and the faces surrounding them became a smear of curious, judging expressions. "You're trembling," Arthur observed, his voice low and emotionless. "I'm quite well," Augusta lied, forcing her feet to continue moving in time with the music. The pain in her abdomen had shifted from a dull ache to something sharper, more insistent. Each step sent a jolt through her body, and she could feel the warmth spreading between her legs, soaking into her undergarments, blood. She was bleeding, and there was nothing she could do about it here now, in front of everyone. "Don't make a scene," Arthur said quietly, noticing her struggle. His grip tightened, not with concern but with warning. They had an audience, and appearances had to be maintained at all costs. Augusta tried to focus on his face, to ground herself in something solid, but Arthur wasn't looking at her. His gaze drifted over her shoulder, scanning the crowd, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. He'd perfected this skill over their 6 months of marriage, the art of being physically near her while remaining emotionally miles away. Another turn, another wave of dizziness. Augusta's knees weakened, and she stumbled slightly. Arthur caught her, his arm tightening around her waist, but his expression remained cold. "Steady yourself," he commanded. "We're almost finished, almost finished. Just a few more minutes of this torture, a few more rotations around the floor, and then she could escape to somewhere private, somewhere she could address whatever was happening to her body, to their baby." She just had to hold on a little longer, but her body had other plans. The pain sharpened into something unbearable, a cramping sensation that stole her breath and made black spots dance across her vision. Augusta gasped, her free hand instinctively moving to her belly, to the child who suddenly felt terrifyingly still. "Arthur," she whispered desperately, "please, I need to stop. Something's wrong with the baby." But the music was loud and Arthur wasn't listening. He never listened. He guided her through another turn, his attention still somewhere beyond her, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. "Arthur!" Augusta tried again, louder this time, panic seeping into her voice. He finally looked at her, and irritation flashed in his eyes. "Keep your voice down. Everyone is watching." Everyone was watching. That was all that mattered to him. Not her pain, not their child's distress, not the fact that his wife was quite literally falling apart in his arms. Just the appearance of propriety, the maintenance of dignity, the preservation of the Ashbourne name and reputation. The ballroom spun violently, and Augusta felt her legs turn to water. She tried to tell him one more time, tried to make him understand that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel was Arthur's face, finally coming into focus, finally seeing her. But it was too late. Augusta's hand reached desperately for him, her fingers grasping at his coat, seeking support that wasn't there. "Arthur!" she breathed, his name a prayer and an accusation all at once, and then she was falling, time slowed to a crawl. Augusta felt herself going down, felt gravity claiming her, felt the terror of the fall mixing with a strange sense of relief. At least the pretense was over. At least she didn't have to smile and dance and pretend anymore. Arthur's eyes widened in horror as he finally understood what was happening. He lunged forward, his arms reaching for her, but he was a fraction of a second too slow. His hands caught her around the waist, breaking her fall but unable to prevent them both from going down. They crashed to the polished marble floor in a tangle of limbs and silk, Augusta's head coming to rest against Arthur's chest. The music stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening, broken only by Augusta's labored breathing and the collective gasp of 300 shocked witnesses. And then someone screamed. Augusta's emerald gown was spreading dark across the white marble floor, blood pooling beneath her, impossible to hide or ignore. The crimson stain grew larger with each passing second, a vivid testimony to the crisis everyone had been too polite or too blind to see coming. Arthur's arms tightened around her, and Augusta felt his heart hammering against her cheek. She tried to look up at him, tried to see his face, but her vision was fading, everything going grey at the edges. "The baby," she managed to whisper, her hand moving weakly to her belly. I'm sorry. I tried to tell you. I tried— No, Arthur said, and his voice cracked in a way Augusta had never heard before. No, don't apologize. Stay with me. Augusta, stay with me. She wanted to. She wanted to so desperately. But the darkness was closing in, soft and quiet and painless, so different from the agony of the past hour. Augusta's eyes fluttered closed, and the last thing she heard was Arthur shouting for a doctor, his voice raw with panic and something that almost sounded like anguish. Someone get a doctor! Augusta, please. Augusta! His hands cradled her face, and Augusta felt something wet drop onto her cheek. Was he crying? No, that couldn't be right. Arthur didn't cry. Arthur didn't feel anything at all, especially not for her. But as consciousness slipped away entirely, as the ballroom and the music and the shocked whispers faded to nothing, Augusta felt those tears on her skin and wondered if perhaps in the end she'd been wrong about her husband after all. The last coherent thought she had before the darkness claimed her completely was that she'd finally gotten Arthur to see her, to hold her, to cry for her. She'd just had to nearly die to make it happen. Arthur Fairmont had carried wounded soldiers from battlefields, had held his mother's hand as she took her last breath, had cradled his first wife's lifeless body after the doctors had given up. He thought he understood what it meant to be helpless, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the terror that gripped him as he lifted Augusta's limp form from the blood-stained ballroom floor and carried her through a crowd of 300 silent, staring witnesses. She was so light in his arms, too light, and her head lolled against his shoulder in a way that made his chest constrict with fear. The emerald gown that had looked so beautiful hours ago was now soaked with blood, and it kept spreading, kept staining his coat, his hands, a visceral reminder of what his coldness had cost. Get out of my way, he snarled at the crowd that pressed too close, their faces masks of shock and morbid curiosity. Move! Lord Harrington appeared, his face pale. My wife has prepared a guest room upstairs. The doctor has been sent for. This way, Your Grace. Arthur followed numbly, his arms tightening around Augusta as he climbed the stairs. She was so still, too still. He could feel her breathing, shallow and rapid against his chest, but her eyes remained closed, her face deathly pale. The guest room was small but clean, the bed already turned down. Arthur laid Augusta on the white sheets and watched helplessly as her blood immediately began to soak through them. A maid appeared with towels, but Arthur couldn't move, couldn't look away from his wife's ashen face. Your Grace, Lady Harrington said gently, touching his arm, the doctor will need space to work. Perhaps you should wait outside. No. The word came out harsh, final. I'm not leaving her. But Lady Harrington was insistent, and eventually Arthur found himself in the corridor outside the room, pacing like a caged animal. His hands were covered in Augusta's blood. He stared at them, at the dark red staining his skin, and felt something crack open inside his chest. This was his fault. All of it. She'd tried to tell him she was unwell. She'd begged him to stop dancing. And he'd dismissed her concerns, had told her not to make a scene, had cared more about appearances than about the woman carrying his child. Arthur. He turned to find Lady Victoria standing nearby, her expression a mixture of false sympathy and barely concealed satisfaction. I'm so sorry. This must bring back terrible memories of losing dear Caroline. Something snapped inside Arthur. Get away from me, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I said get away. The roar echoed through the corridor, and Victoria stumbled backward, her face flushing with shock and anger. She retreated quickly, leaving Arthur alone with his guilt and terror. Lord Pemberton, one of Arthur's oldest friends, approached cautiously. Arthur, she was clearly unwell all evening. We all saw it. You were dancing while she was— Don't you think I know that? Arthur's voice broke, and he slumped against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor, his head in his bloody hands. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. I treated her like an inconvenience for 6 months, and now she's dying because of me. Pemberton sat beside him in silence. Minutes stretched into hours. Arthur's mind tormented him with memories he'd deliberately ignored. Augusta, trying to make conversation at breakfast while he read his newspaper. Augusta asking about his day while he responded with monosyllables. Augusta's hand on her belly, loving their child while he could barely acknowledge its existence. Her face when the doctor had confirmed the pregnancy, searching his expression for some sign of joy that he'd refused to give. "I loved you," she'd whispered as she fell. "I'm sorry I wasn't her," the words haunted him. Augusta had spent 6 months apologizing for not being Caroline, never understanding that the problem wasn't her. It was him. He was the one who'd refused to see her, refused to let himself feel anything, because feeling meant risking the kind of pain that had nearly destroyed him when Caroline died. But he'd caused pain anyway, just not to himself, to Augusta, who'd done nothing but try to be a good wife to a man who'd treated her like an obligation. The door opened and the doctor emerged, his face grave. Arthur was on his feet instantly. "Will she live?" The doctor wiped his hands on a towel, choosing his words carefully. "The Duchess has lost a significant amount of blood. The next 24 hours are critical. If she survives the night, her chances improve considerably. And the child." Arthur's throat tightened. "Your son lives, Your Grace. He's strong, remarkably so given the circumstances. But his mother—" The doctor paused. "Her survival is far from certain. She's asking for you, a son, the heir he'd demanded, the whole purpose of this marriage." And suddenly Arthur realized he didn't care. The title, the estates, the succession, none of it mattered if Augusta died. None of it had ever mattered as much as the woman he'd been too blind and too cowardly to see. "Can I go in?" His voice came out hoarse. The doctor nodded. "Yes, but Your Grace, you should prepare yourself. She's very weak." Arthur pushed past him into the room. Augusta lay against white pillows, her dark hair spread around her like a shadow. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. She looked impossibly fragile, as if a strong wind might carry her away. He approached the bed slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this moment. When he reached her side, he carefully took her hand in his. It was cold, so cold, and he wrapped both of his hands around it, trying to warm her. "Augusta," he whispered, "I'm here." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then finding his face. "The baby?" Her voice was barely audible. "He's well," Arthur said, and his own voice broke, strong like his mother. A tear slipped down Augusta's pale cheek. "I'm sorry. I should have told you I was unwell. I didn't want to disappoint you further." Those words shattered what remained of Arthur's carefully constructed walls. He sank into the chair beside her bed, still holding her hand, and finally let himself feel everything he'd been holding back for 6 months. The grief, the guilt, the love he'd been too terrified to acknowledge. "Disappoint me?" he choked out. "Augusta, I've been the one disappointing you since the day we married." Augusta's eyes struggled to focus on Arthur's face. She must be dreaming, she thought, or dying, because the man sitting beside her bed, holding her hand as if it was something precious, looked like her husband, but couldn't possibly be him. This man's eyes were red-rimmed, his face etched with anguish. Her Arthur never showed emotion. Her Arthur barely looked at her at all. "You don't have to pretend now," she whispered, her voice weak. "I know you married me for duty. I've accepted it. No." Arthur's grip on her hand tightened. "Listen to me, please." He stopped, struggling with words that had been locked inside him for so long. Augusta waited, watching emotions chase across his face. Fear, regret, something else she couldn't name. "When Caroline died," he finally began, his voice raw, "I thought I would die too. The pain was unbearable, so I made a choice. I locked my heart away. I told myself if I never loved again, I'd never hurt again." He looked down at their joined hands. "I was a coward." Augusta wanted to argue, but she had no strength. She simply listened as her husband, for the first time, let her see inside the walls he'd built. "My mother arranged our marriage, and I resented you for it," Arthur continued. "Resented you for existing, for not being Caroline, for making me feel things I'd buried. These past 6 months, I've watched you try to reach me again and again while I remained deliberately cruel." "You were grieving," Augusta managed. "I was hiding," Arthur corrected. "Behind grief, behind duty, behind coldness. And you—" His voice broke completely. "You were so patient. You transformed our home. You loved our child before he was born. You tried to be a wife to a man who wouldn't be a husband." A tear rolled down his cheek, and Augusta realized with shock that Arthur was crying. "Actually crying. Tonight when you fell, when I saw the blood, when you said you loved me and apologized for not being her." He had to stop, compose himself. "You were never her, Augusta. You are braver than Caroline ever needed to be, stronger, more patient. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. Arthur, Augusta started, but a wave of pain cut off her words. The doctor appeared immediately, checking her pulse. She needs to rest, Your Grace. Her body is fighting very hard right now. I don't know if I can love the way you deserve, Arthur said quickly, desperately, before he could be ushered out. But I want to try. If you'll let me. If you survive this, I promise I will spend every day trying to be the husband you should have had from the beginning. Augusta's hand trembled in his. You're here now, she whispered. That's enough. Her eyes closed, and Arthur felt her hand go limp in his. Panic seized him. Augusta? Augusta? The doctor pushed him back gently. She's not dying, Your Grace, just exhausted. Her body needs rest to heal. But Arthur refused to leave. He pulled the chair closer to her bed and kept hold of her hand. I'm not going anywhere, he told her sleeping form. Not this time. Never again. Through the long night he sat vigil. Each shallow breath she took felt like a gift. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, terrified that each breath might be her last. In the early morning hours her fever spiked dangerously. This is the crisis point, the doctor said grimly. The next few hours will determine everything. Arthur leaned close to Augusta's ear. Fight, he whispered. Please, Augusta, fight. Come back to me. Our son needs you. I need you, he meant it. Somewhere in the last terrible hours he'd realized the truth. He loved her. Not the way he'd loved Caroline, that young, easy love of his youth. This was different, deeper, born of admiration for her strength, her grace under impossible circumstances, her capacity to love without hope of return. He loved her. And he might lose her before he ever got the chance to tell her properly. As dawn broke through the windows, Augusta's fever began to break. Her breathing steadied. Color slowly returned to her cheeks. When her eyes finally fluttered open and found him still there, still holding her hand, she managed a weak smile. You stayed. I stayed, Arthur confirmed, bringing her hand to his lips. And I'm never leaving again. 2 weeks after the ball, Augusta woke in her chambers at Ashbourne Estate to find Arthur asleep in the chair beside her bed. It had become a familiar sight. Every morning for 14 days, he'd been there when she opened her eyes. His cravat would be loose or missing entirely, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, his face marked with exhaustion. But he was there. This morning she watched him sleep and marveled at the transformation. The cold, distant Duke who'd barely spoken to her for 6 months had become this man who refused to leave her side, who brought her meals on trays and insisted on feeding her when she was too weak, who read to her in the evenings from books of poetry, who slept in that uncomfortable chair rather than in his own bed in the East Wing. As if sensing her gaze, Arthur's eyes opened. You're awake, he said, sitting up immediately. How do you feel? Are you in pain? Should I call for the doctor? I'm well, Augusta assured him, touched by his concern. Better each day. Thank God. Arthur reached for her hand, another gesture that had become natural over these weeks of recovery. I was thinking perhaps today, if you feel strong enough, we might take a short walk in the garden. The doctor says gentle exercise would be beneficial. Augusta nodded, and later that afternoon, with Arthur's arm supporting her, they made their slow way outside. The roses she'd planted months ago were in full bloom, their fragrance sweet in the warm air. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a bench beneath an old oak tree. I need to ask you something, Augusta said as they sat. Why did you really marry me, Arthur? He didn't look away from the question. Duty, he answered honestly. Obligation. My mother arranged it before she died, and I couldn't refuse her dying wish. I needed an heir to preserve Ashbourne for the next generation. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. And now? Augusta asked softly. Arthur turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. Now I thank God every day that my mother was wiser than I was, that she saw what I was too blind and too stubborn to see. What was that? That you were exactly what this house needed. What I needed. He paused, struggling with vulnerability. I married you for duty, Augusta, but I want to build a life with you for love. The word hung between them, precious and fragile. Augusta felt tears prick her eyes. Love? I know I have no right to your forgiveness after 6 months of cruelty, Arthur continued. I know I've given you every reason to hate me, but if you'll allow it, I'd like to start again. Not as duke and obligation, but as husband and wife. As partners. Augusta looked at this man who'd broken her heart and was now offering to heal it. I never stopped loving you, she admitted. Even when it hurt. Even when you gave me nothing in return. Then let me spend the rest of my life earning what you've already given freely, Arthur said. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was gentle, reverent, full of promise. When they parted, Augusta smiled. What about Caroline? The question could have destroyed the moment, but Arthur didn't flinch from it. I loved her. That will always be true. But love isn't finite, Augusta. Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for her. He cupped her face gently. Caroline would have liked you. She would have wanted me to be happy again. Can you accept that? That I carry her memory while building a future with you. I never asked you to forget her, Augusta replied. I only wanted a place beside her in your heart, not instead of her. You have so much more than that. Arthur's voice was thick with emotion. You've brought me back to life. In the nursery, baby Thomas began to cry and they both smiled. He's hungry, Augusta said, starting to rise. I'll get him, Arthur offered and disappeared into the house. He returned moments later with their son in his arms, still awkward but determined. Augusta watched as he carefully placed Thomas in her arms for feeding, saw the wonder and fear in his eyes as he looked at the child who'd nearly cost him everything. I'm terrified, Arthur admitted softly, of losing you again, of something happening to him. Of caring this much. Augusta reached out with her free hand and took his. Then we'll be terrified together, she said. But we won't let fear stop us from living, from loving. Arthur sat beside her on the bench, his arm around her shoulders, watching as she nursed their son in the garden she'd brought back to life. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. 3 months after Augusta's recovery, Lady Victoria Ashford arrived at Ashbourne Estate unannounced. The butler tried to turn her away, but she swept past him with the imperious authority she'd always possessed, making her way directly to the morning room where she'd been told the Duke and Duchess were taking breakfast. What she found stopped her in her tracks. Arthur sat close to Augusta at the small table, not at opposite ends as propriety might dictate. Their heads were bent together over something, his hand covering hers on the tabletop. Baby Thomas lay in a cradle nearby, and as Victoria watched, Arthur rose to lift the fussy infant, settling him against his shoulder with surprising competence while continuing his conversation with Augusta. This was not the cold, grief-stricken Duke she'd known. This was a man transformed, and Victoria felt a surge of bitter anger at the sight. How domestic, she said sharply from the doorway. Both Arthur and Augusta looked up. Arthur's expression immediately hardened. Lady Victoria, I don't recall inviting you. I came to check on the Duchess, Victoria replied, her eyes taking in Augusta's healthy colour, the way she smiled at her husband, the obvious contentment in the room. The last I saw her, she was bleeding to death on a ballroom floor. A situation you contributed to, Arthur said coldly, passing Thomas to Augusta before standing to face his cousin. You deliberately kept her standing when she was clearly unwell, parading her around the ballroom when she needed to rest. Victoria's face flushed. I did no such thing. How was I to know she was so fragile? You knew exactly what you were doing, Augusta said quietly, rising to stand beside her husband with Thomas in her arms. But I forgive you, Lady Victoria. Your cruelty inadvertently gave me something precious, and what would that be? Victoria asked scornfully. Augusta looked up at Arthur, and the love in her eyes was unmistakable. It gave me my husband. Victoria's mouth tightened into a thin line. Does it not concern you, Duchess, that you nearly died because the Duke was too preoccupied to notice your distress? That his negligence almost cost you everything? Arthur stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. You're no longer welcome in this house, Victoria. I'll ask you once to leave. If you refuse, I'll have you removed. Society won't forget what happened, Victoria hissed. The scandal of it. Everyone saw— Society can think what it likes, Arthur interrupted. My concern is my family. Something you clearly know nothing about. Leave. Now. For a moment, Victoria looked as if she might argue further, but something in Arthur's expression, an implacable resolve she'd never seen before, made her reconsider. With a final contemptuous glare, she turned and swept from the room. After her departure, Augusta leaned against Arthur's side. "That wasn't easy for you." "She's family. You're my family," Arthur replied simply, kissing the top of her head. "You and Thomas. Everything else is just noise." The months that followed brought continued healing. Arthur moved permanently into Augusta's chambers, declaring that the arrangement of separate wings was ridiculous for a married couple. The servants adjusted quickly, and soon the entire household had relaxed into a warmth that had been missing for years. Arthur learned to be a father, awkwardly at first, but with growing confidence. He would spend hours with Thomas, talking to the baby about estate matters and politics as if the infant could understand. Augusta would watch them together and feel her heart swell with love for both her husband and their son. But as autumn approached and the anniversary of the Harrington ball drew near, Augusta noticed Arthur growing tense. One evening she found him standing at the window of their chamber, staring out at the darkening grounds. "What troubles you?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "The Harringtons have invited us to their anniversary ball," Arthur said quietly. "Same date as last year. I've declined, of course." "Why?" Augusta asked. Arthur turned to her, incredulous. "Why? Augusta, you nearly died at their ball. The thought of returning there, of you being in that ballroom again—" "The ballroom didn't hurt me," Augusta interrupted gently, "and hiding from what happened won't change it. Perhaps we need to return, to prove to ourselves and to society that we've healed." "I don't care what society thinks," Arthur insisted. "I know, but I do." Augusta took his hands. "People whisper when they see us in town. They look at us with pity or judgment. Let's show them something different. Let's show them that love can grow even from the darkest circumstances." Arthur was silent for a long moment. "If we go and you feel even slightly unwell, we leave immediately." "No arguments," Augusta smiled. Her agreed. The night of the anniversary ball arrived with crisp autumn air and clear skies. As their carriage pulled up to Harrington House, Augusta felt Arthur's hand tighten on hers. "We don't have to do this," he said. "Yes, we do," Augusta replied. "Together." The ballroom looked exactly as it had a year ago. Same chandeliers, same marble floors, same orchestra. But everything else was different. This time, when they were announced, Arthur kept Augusta's hand firmly in his. This time, when whispers followed them, they were whispers of a different kind. "Look at them. He hasn't taken his eyes off her. They say he's completely devoted now. True love." "Who would have thought?" Lord and Lady Harrington greeted them warmly. "Your Grace, we're honored you chose to attend," Lady Harrington said to Augusta. "After last year, we weren't sure—" "Last year was difficult," Augusta acknowledged. "But it also brought unexpected blessings. I wouldn't change it even if I could." As the evening progressed, Augusta was approached by several ladies who'd witnessed her collapse. Their curiosity was barely disguised as concern, but Augusta answered their questions with grace and dignity. Arthur remained at her side throughout, his presence a constant support. When the orchestra began a waltz, the same melody that had been playing when Augusta fell, a hush fell over the ballroom. Everyone remembered. Everyone was watching to see what the Duke and Duchess would do. Arthur turned to Augusta and offered his hand. "Dance with me?" Augusta hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. "I'd be honored." As they took their position on the dance floor, Augusta felt the weight of hundreds of eyes. But this time, instead of judgment, she felt Arthur's arm secure around her waist. Instead of coldness, she felt his warmth. Instead of distance, she felt connection. "Are you well?" he asked softly as they began to move. "I'm perfect," Augusta replied. "If you feel dizzy, if anything hurts, if you need to stop—" "Arthur," Augusta interrupted gently, "I'm not going to fall. Not with you holding me." They danced, and gradually the other couples joined them on the floor. The ballroom filled with movement and music, but Augusta was only aware of her husband, of the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, of the gentle pressure of his hand at her waist, of the love that had been so hard-won but was now unshakable. "Do you remember this night last year?" Arthur asked quietly. "How could I forget?" Augusta replied. "It was the worst and best night of my life. How can it be both?" "It was the night you finally saw me," Augusta said simply. "The night everything changed. Yes, I was terrified. Yes, I was in pain. But it was also the night you came back to me. Worth all the suffering to get to this moment." Arthur pulled her slightly closer. "Propriety be damned. I was wrong when I said I didn't know if I could love the way you deserved. You've taught me. Every day you teach me how to be vulnerable, how to choose love over fear, how to be the man I should have been from the beginning. And you've taught me that some loves are worth fighting for, Augusta replied. Even when they seem impossible, even when it hurts, even when you have to fall before someone catches you. The waltz ended, and spontaneous applause filled the ballroom. But Arthur and Augusta barely noticed. They stood in the center of the floor, holding each other, lost in their own world. Later, they stepped out onto the terrace for air. The London lights sparkled below them, and music drifted from inside. Augusta placed her hand on her belly, where new life was already growing. She hadn't told Arthur yet about the second pregnancy, but she would tonight. Thank you, Arthur said suddenly. For what? For not giving up on me. For loving me when I gave you nothing in return. For surviving. For giving me a second chance I didn't deserve. Augusta turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. We saved each other, Arthur. I gave you love, but you gave me purpose. A home, a family. Everything I'd lost when my parents died. From inside, Thomas's cry echoed through the ballroom. They'd brought him along tonight, trusting him to a nurse in one of the Harringtons' guest rooms. Augusta and Arthur exchanged a smile. Duty calls? Arthur said. Not duty, Augusta corrected, taking his hand as they walked back inside together. Joy. They made their way through the ballroom, and Augusta noticed how people watched them with warmth now, rather than pity. How couples smiled at them, perhaps seeing in their story a reminder that love could grow in unexpected places, that second chances were real, that healing was possible. In the guest room, they found Thomas fussing in his nurse's arms. Arthur took his son, and the baby immediately settled against his father's shoulder. Augusta watched them together, her heart full to overflowing. Should we go home? Arthur asked. Yes, Augusta agreed. Let's go home. As their carriage pulled away from Harrington House, Augusta looked back at the ballroom windows, glowing with light and life. A year ago, she'd left this place on the edge of death, her future uncertain, her marriage a cold arrangement. Tonight, she left it whole, healed, loved beyond measure. What are you thinking? Arthur asked, Thomas sleeping peacefully between them. That I'm grateful, Augusta said. For all of it. The pain, the struggle, even the loneliness. Because it brought us here. Arthur lifted her hand to his lips. I love you, Augusta Fairmont. Not because you gave me an heir. Not because duty requires it. But because you're you. Brave, patient, impossibly kind. You saw something in me worth saving when I'd given up on myself. I love you too, Augusta whispered. And I always will. As the carriage carried them home through the London streets, past the houses of lords and ladies who'd witnessed both their tragedy and their triumph, Augusta leaned her head on Arthur's shoulder and closed her eyes. She thought about the frightened young woman who'd stood at the altar 6 months into a loveless marriage, pregnant and alone. She thought about the woman who'd fallen on a ballroom floor, bleeding and broken, and she thought about the woman she was now. Loved, cherished, partner to a man who'd learned to open his heart again. Sometimes, she reflected, you had to fall before you could truly be caught. Sometimes you had to break before you could heal stronger. Sometimes love didn't arrive in a thunderclap, but grew slowly, painfully, beautifully from the ashes of grief and fear. The Duke had refused love, had built walls around his heart, had pushed away the woman brave enough to stand beside him. But in the end, love had won. Not the easy kind, but the kind forged in crisis, tempered by pain, made unbreakable by choice. As they arrived home at Ashbourne Estate, the windows glowing with welcoming light, Augusta knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, that the journey, however painful, had been worth every moment to arrive at this perfect ending that was really just a beginning. The Duke had finally learned to love, and the young bride who'd nearly died in his arms had taught him how.